Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Um, Another online edition of the course on the history of British art through 10 centuries. We are still in the 18th century, and today I'd like to talk with you basing on the Moodle presentation that you have entitled Return to Nature. This is a very important topic in 18th century art. And something that will return in many different ways. So we start as usual with later artists' response to this topic, and the first two illustrations I would like you to see feature 19th century art. One is a painting by one of the Pre-Raphaelites. We are going to discuss their art in greater detail later on. So John Everett Miller, his painting called Cherry Ripe, which, as you will see later, is based directly on an 18th century child portrait. Not just any child portrait, but a very important child portrait from the 18th century. Which shows a little girl in the natural surrounding looking very, very sweet. Sweet as a chocolate box, really. So we have this Victorian perception of 18th century return to nature theme, but with a pound of sugar put on it. The other 19th century illustration comes from the Illustrated Press and shows a stereotypical cartoon character called John Bull. You can sometimes still meet this character. I've seen pubs named after him and such places. So who was John Bull? John Bull was a cartoon character who was invented to embody the ideal of an 18th century country gentleman. So a relatively wealthy man, though not an aristocrat, living outside the city before the Industrial Revolution. So the embodiment of the good old times before the industrialization and urbanization, before the Victorian world and all its problems, the embodiment of conservative values, common sense, and the world that was in the past, in the 19th century, when this character was first designed. So now back to the real 18th century, and what happens in the 18th century as a general trend in art is return to nature. It's one of the very powerful trends in the 18th century. How is it visible in the art? So if we look at architecture, this is architecture in human scale. These are comfortable surroundings intended for comfort and pleasure rather than opulence and grandeur. This is also, the 18th century is also a great time for gardening. We have the beginning of what is known as the English garden, and we have the first great garden designer. His name was Lancelot Brown, but everybody knew him by his nickname, Capability Brown. So here we have some photographs of the gardens that he designed, especially Stowe Gardens, also Stourhead Gardens in Wiltshire. And these are your quintessential English gardens. If you know anything about the history of gardening, there are basically two grand styles. The French style and the English style. The French style was the Baroque garden, like the garden in Versailles, which was very ornamental, very carefully designed, and which showed man's domination over nature. The English garden was supposed to look natural. There was nothing geometric about it. It all looked like natural forests, natural meadows, natural ponds and rivers, whereas most of this, in very many cases, definitely in the case that you have in the illustrations, were carefully designed. So much so that even those waterworks, the rivers and the lakes, were artificially dug with one purpose of making it more beautiful and picturesque. So we have those beautiful residences, comfortable residences with beautiful gardens in France, but to some extent also in England. This is the time of Rococo. This is the time of the art of pleasure, of sensuality. This is the time of aristocratic ladies dressing up and pretending to be shepherdesses, to play with beautiful powdered sheep in the meadows and dancing, and there is some interest in the idealized life of the country people and also in the idealized life of the so-called noble savage, that is exotic people. This is the moment when Europeans learn about Native Americans, about other tribal communities, and there is a growing belief in the 18th century that these are the people who are happier, who are perhaps even more moral than those living in the modern world. So the life of a country gentleman, the life of a country lady becomes an ideal, of course for those who could afford it. And the lucky few who had estates start to engage artists to paint their estates and to paint the elements of their estates that they are most proud of. So, for example, horses. So in the middle of the 18th century, we have a whole subgenre of horse portraits. Sometimes they include people. Of course, these horses were very noble, expensive animals that belonged to the rich. So sometimes we have the owners of these animals portrayed alongside them, but sometimes it's just the servants of the horses, the grooms, the people who trained the horses, who kept them clean and fed, rather than the owners. So we have the first artist whose name I would like you to remember, and this is George Stubbs, and he was the specialist of horse portraiture. He would paint the horses, sometimes with the owners. You have the Countess of Canning riding on one of her horses, but you have quite a lot of pictures that feature on the animals themselves, especially the famous prize-winning horse called Gimcrack, which won several awards during the horse races, and you have multiple paintings showing this horse with the jockey, with the servants, with the people who basically serve the horse, not serve the horse's master. You don't even have the master in the painting every time. Of course, if we talk about horse portraits, you have to remember these were pedigree animals. These were animals that drew the viewer's attention not only to the wealth of the owner, but also to the owner's emphasis on breed, on blood. So just as the aristocratic families still relied on breed and blood, so did the horses, to a smaller extent also dogs, but the horses especially. So you have quite a lot of horse portraiture. As far as dogs are concerned, of course, most of the dogs in the country estates were working dogs, so they were hunting dogs, shepherd dogs, but increasingly, especially the ladies, start to have dogs for company. They start to have dogs for pleasure. And as you will see in a little moment, many portraits of people start featuring natural elements as well. So they are either set in nature, usually not completely wild nature, not the wild woods, but a park, a field, a garden, and very often these people are accompanied by their animals, either companion animals or working animals, such as in the case of hunting animals. But what you can see is the growing interest of people in nature and the perception that the love of nature shows not only their wealth but also their humanity. Thank you. As far as 18th century portraiture is concerned in Britain, there are two names of artists I would like you to remember: Thomas Gainsborough and Joshua Reynolds, Sir Joshua Reynolds. So they were both, as you will see in the illustrations, they were both specialists in this genre, although not only. Especially Thomas Gainsborough, when he wanted to paint for his own pleasure, he chose animals or landscapes. But of course, he had to do what he called the face business for money. Joshua Reynolds produced even more, I guess around 2,000 portraits of various patrons, but he's also remembered for one more thing. He was the first president of the Royal Academy of Arts. So a new institution established in the 1760s to train artists. Before that, before the mid-18th century, if you wanted to become a painter, the only way to do it was to become an apprentice of an already established painter. In the 18th century, with the establishment of the Royal Academy of Arts, we have a completely different approach to what it means to be an artist. For people of previous generations, to be an artist, to be a painter, was merely a skill. It was a craft that you could learn, that you could master. Of course, you needed talent for that, but first of all, you needed to master the skill. For people like Reynolds, art becomes, first of all, an intellectual pursuit. So, to become a truly good artist, you do not need only to master the skill, but also you need proper humanist studies. So you can very well understand the subjects, the themes of religion, mythology. You can understand the ways in which to express the personality of the sitter through your art, and the choice of subjects becomes as important, and in time even more important, than the mastery in the skill of painting. Actually, the mastery in the skill of painting is more or less taken for granted. So this is something that will be very important, especially when we talk about the 19th century and the Victorian art. The academic art according to which an artist is not only a skilled craftsman, but also an intellectual interpreting the reality. So it starts in the 18th century, the academy and the formal training of painters. If we look at the portraits of Gainsborough and Reynolds, they were great rivals. They didn't really like each other too much. They never collaborated. Sometimes you can see quite visible element of rivalry, especially if you compare the portraits of the same sitters sometimes, like Miss Siddons, who was a famous actress of this period. You can see two portraits, one by Joshua Reynolds and one by Thomas Gainsborough, and I leave it to you to decide which one you like better. Gainsborough was quite famous, quite renowned for his, you might say, Van Dyck-esque propensity for painting the fabrics, the textures. Reynolds was more of a psychological portraitist, so he tried to catch the personality of the sitter rather than only to render the beautiful clothes and textures and accessories and hair. But if you look at Gainsborough's paintings, they are not completely devoid of psychological probing either. So let's look at some of the very famous ones, like Mr. and Mrs. Andrews. This is a portrait of a married couple with the natural surroundings as the background. Actually, it's been said that if you cut the half where the couple is seated, you can still have a very beautiful painting showing the field and the trees and the hills in the distance and the sky and clouds. So something that Gainsborough really loved painting. But of course he had to paint people as well. So here we have this married couple in the middle of the 18th century when there was a new lifestyle, a new view on marriage becoming popular, and the widespread opinion was that the good marriage was a marriage of companions, the marriage of friends, not an arranged marriage that would only care for money and titles, but the marriage of companions and friends, the so-called companionate marriage. So you have couples walking together, talking together, spending time together. There's been quite a lot of discussion among the art critics whether Mr. and Mrs. Andrews are a good marriage. They seem quite awkward. They are probably a bit shy to be posing for a picture. We have the man with the typical paraphernalia of hunting, so he has a gun and a dog by his side, a dog looking very loving and faithful, and rather stiff and posed Mrs. Andrews. And if you look very close, you can see that this painting is unfinished. There is a patch on the lap of Mrs. Andrews that is missing, and we may try to think what was there. And I usually at this point ask the students to guess what there could be. Some say a bouquet of flowers, some say a book. Actually, if you do a close-up, you can see the sketch of what is missing. And this was a dead bird, apparently a pheasant, hunted by Mr. Andrews. So yes, he was the provider. He brought dinner, and this is probably why Mrs. Andrews is so shy and looking quite frightened, because she has a dead bird on her lap. A similar portrait was made as a self-portrait with his wife by Gainsborough. He experimented with this double marital portrait showing himself and his own wife in a garden. You can see some garden architecture in the neoclassical style in the distance, and they are engaged in a conversation. You can see a book, so they probably read the same book, and now they are discussing the content of the book. So these are the people who have something in common, a loving, friendly couple. A similar attitude is seen in a very famous marital portrait by Gainsborough called The Morning Walk, showing another couple of country gentleman and lady, not aristocrats, they do not have titles, they are just Mr. and Mrs., but they are seen walking in the park, formally dressed, so they are not dressed in some informal home clothes. There was no such notion at that time. So they are elegant people wearing fashionable clothes, fashionable powdered wigs, So they are very cultured people, sophisticated, and they take a morning walk with a doggy, again, a faithful dog in a well-kept park, engaged in a conversation together. When Joshua Reynolds wanted to paint his self-portrait, he chose to portray himself as an intellectual with the tools of his trade. So with some books, with classical sculpture behind him. So he is an artist rather than a good husband. Here we have a big selection, well not a big, if you Google that you can find hundreds of paintings by Reynolds and Gainsborough showing different sitters, usually rather wealthy people, so military officers and country gentlemen and socialites and actresses and dancers and sometimes quite famous people, like we have here a portrait by Gainsborough of Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, a very famous lady from the aristocracy, very respected and admired for her beauty and style, and also having some informal influence on the politics of the day. But also we have slightly less reputable ladies such as Miss Nellie O'Brien, who was a famous courtesan. She doesn't look like a loose woman in Reynolds' portrait. She is a beautiful, charming young woman with a doggy. So yes, she's one of the fashionable, rich people who start having animals, especially dogs, for companionship. Reynolds and Gainsborough were not the only painters who specialized in portraits. There was, for example, George Romney, and here we have one of the many portraits by George Romney of Emma Hamilton, a socialite, an actress, and also a scandalous woman. She became the mistress of the great national hero, Horatio Nelson, and the sea captain who defeated Napoleon's fleet. Unfortunately, he died in the process. But Romney had a huge crush on Emma Hamilton, and he painted her obsessively many, many times. Not only her, he was quite a popular painter. Another one was a Scottish artist, Thomas Lawrence, and you also have portraits made by him. And if you look at all these mid-18th century or late 18th century portraits, they are all trying to imitate Sir Anthony van Dyck. They are trying to out Van Dyck each other. So, of course, they are all very, very talented, but they all have this kind of Van Dyck quality. And in the next part, we'll talk about children and child portraits.